In the year 1851 of the Third Age, the plains of Rhovanion were swarmed by a new type of Easterling. These were the Wainriders, and for almost 100 years they warred with Gondor and its allies, almost bringing the mighty kingdom to its knees. In this video, we'll talk about their history, who they were, and what might have happened to them. In the year 1636 of the Third Age, the Great Plague ripped through Gondor, killing millions and leaving the kingdom at the mercy of its enemies. Fortunately for Gondor, these enemies had also not been spared from the plague, for the plague itself had begun in the east of Middle-earth the previous year or earlier, and had left a long trail of destruction before it even reached Gondor. In the aftermath of the sickness, Gondor's eastern borders would be quiet for the next 200 years, as the survivors began the long, generational task of rebuilding. This peace and quiet came to an end in 1851. Far beyond the site of Gondor, a new people had arisen in the east of Middle-earth, beyond the Sea of Rhûn. Their origins were a mystery, and Gondorian scholars were unsure of whether they were a single people or were in fact a confederation of tribes. Regardless, these Easterlings were better armed, they were better trained, their chieftains rode in imposing chariots, and their people travelled in large wains. For that reason, they were known as the Wainriders. For 5 years, the Wainriders warred with the Northmen of Rhovanion, who had also been devastated by the Great Plague of 2 centuries earlier, and by 1856 Rhovanion had been mostly overrun. In Gondor, Narmakil II, who had only been king for 6 years, marched over the Anduin and into the Brownlands with a large army intent on destroying the Wainriders. But rather unthinkably, Narmakil was killed, his army was defeated, and it was only saved from total destruction by a desperate rearguard action from the surviving Northmen. Fortunately for Gondor, the Wainriders had been dealt enough casualties that they were wary of invading further and were content on completing their conquest of Rhovanion, enslaving the remaining Northmen who dwelt there. Following the disastrous Battle of the Plains, Gondor abandoned all of its lands east of the Anduin, with the exception of Ithilien. At this point, rather interestingly, the Wainriders are referred to as 2 separate groups. The Wainriders of Rhovanion, and another group only referred to as the Eastern Wainriders. The Wainriders of Rhovanion were those that had conquered the Northmen of Rhovanion, and settled in their former lands between Mirkwood and the Sea of Rhûn. On the other hand, the Eastern Wainriders dwelt beyond the Sea of Rhûn, a place where it is stated that no tidings came to the kings of Gondor. While the Wainriders of Rhovanion warred with Gondor and the surviving Northmen who had fled into the Vales of Anduin, the Eastern Wainriders were busy warring against other peoples to the east and the south, such as the Men of Khand and the Haradrim. This seems to be evidence that the Wainriders were not a unified political force, and were likely a confederation of tribes, possibly led by a dominant tribe, such as what it was like with the Huns of late antiquity. War erupted again in 1899. King Kalimatar of Gondor was keen to avenge the Battle of the Plains, and he got his chance when Marwini, the Lord of the Aethiod, those surviving Northmen who had fled to the Vales of Anduin, informed him of a Northman rebellion brewing in Rhovanion. He also warned that the Wainriders were planning to raid Calenadon. Kalimatar decided to strike first, drawing the Wainriders into battle upon the plains of Dagorlad. With the help of a flanking maneuver by the Aethiod, the Wainriders were defeated and were forced to flee after losing a third of their force. In Rhovanion, the uprising went off as planned. Northmen fugitives hiding in Mirkwood riled up their enslaved brethren while the Wainrider army was away, and the rebels were successful in burning many of the dwellings of the Wainriders, as well as their storehouses and their fortified camps. But this success came with a massive cost. Amongst the Wainriders, both the youth and the old men were expected to fight, as were the young women in defense of their homes. Instead of a soft underbelly, the rebels found a bloodbath, and most of them perished in the fighting, and the Northmen were unable to reclaim their old homes. A lesser foe may have been defeated, but the Wainriders were eager for revenge. Beyond the Sea of Rhûn, the Eastern Wainriders had grown powerful, but the Wainriders bided their time. Just as the Gondorians were not aware of the true strength of the Wainriders knew little of the lands beyond the Anduin, and overestimated the strength of Gondor. In order to overcome the perceived strength of their enemy, they finally put away the sword and began to use the pen. the Eastern Wainriders made peace with their former enemies in Khand and Harad, and it was decided that they would assault Gondor together, from both the east and the south. This wasn't known in Gondor at the time and was deduced by later historians. They also came to the conclusion that Sauron himself was likely behind these efforts, as the Wainriders and their former foes had neither the will nor the wisdom to think of it themselves. Nevertheless, Gondor, now led by King Onderher, was aware of the concerted efforts of his enemies, as he had been warned by Fourth Winnie of the Aethiod, whose lands were under increasing threat from the Wainriders of Rhovanion. In 1944, Gondor and its allies clashed with the Wainriders and their allies at the disaster of the Morannon. The Wainriders demonstrated their martial prowess by overwhelming the Gondorian army before it had a chance to properly deploy, killing Onderher and both his sons. In the south, things went much better for Gondor. General Eärnil was successful in ambushing an army of Haradrim near the crossings of the Poros, and raced north after receiving tidings of the disaster that had occurred there. At this pivotal moment in history, the Wainriders could have attacked Osgiliath, crossed the Anduin and done much damage to Gondor, but their own hubris would betray them. Thinking Gondor defeated, they had a victory feast in Ithilien, and were soon ambushed by Eärnil's forces at the Battle of the Camp. The Wainriders were utterly routed, and many of those who managed to flee ended up perishing in the Dead Marshes. And just like that, the Wainriders completely disappear from history. So what the hell happened to them? Well, the Wainriders didn't just evaporate into midair, they didn't just get Thanos snapped, never to be seen again. In fact, their descendants continued to live in most of the lands that had once been part of the Kingdom of Rhovanion. 500 years later, the Balcoff would rise up to invade Calenadon from the lands east of the Anduin, and although they were poorly armed compared to the Wainriders, their usage of Great Wains led the Gondorians to assume that they were in fact related to the Wainriders. It would not be a stretch to imagine that those same descendants were living there until the War of the Ring. However, as a political and military force, the Wainriders did just seem to evaporate, and Tolkien doesn't really tell us why. Although they lost a major battle, their lands were not invaded, nor were their people put to the sword. Just as I stated earlier, this is likely because the Wainriders were not a single unified people, but were a confederacy of tribes that were likely held together by a single tribe, or at least a series of powerful leaders, much as the Huns were. At the Battle of the Camps, it's likely that the leader and many of the other unifying figures across the Wainriders were actually wiped out, and if there was a prominent tribe, many of their members probably perished. As a result, the Wainriders across Rhovanion and potentially further to the east likely disintegrated as a unified force over the following decades. Various leaders and tribes probably attempted to fill the power vacuum, likely leading to a civil war amongst the survivors. By the time these conflicts ended, the power of the Wainriders was either severely depleted, and the will to once again unify against Gondor probably gone. 500 years later, when the apparent descendants did unify against Gondor as the Balcoff, some of the cultural markers of the Wainriders, such as being well armed and using chariots in warfare, were gone. One interesting theory is that Sauron was responsible for the Wainriders. We know Sauron played a large behind-the-scenes role throughout much of the Third Age, and as previously mentioned, may have been responsible for brokering the peace and organising an alliance between the Wainriders and their former enemies. Yet given the martial proficiency of the Wainriders that wasn't seen in prior groups of Easterlings, and the fact that they were often in close proximity to Mirkwood, where Sauron's power base was at the time, it's possible that the Wainriders were Sauron's pet project, built from the ashes of a plague-devastated rune. A potential link is the convenient rise of the Balcoff. After Sauron vacated Dol Guldur in 2063, the Watchful Peace began, lasting for a period of nearly 400 years. Yet, when Sauron returns in 2460, the Balcoff begin to unify and attack Gondor not even 50 years later. Regardless, until the Witch King himself broke through the gates of Minas Tirith, none of Gondor's foes came closer to achieving total victory. With half of Gondor's army shattered and the road to Osgiliath open, the Wainriders were perhaps days away from dealing the Southern Kingdom a mortal blow, which would have seen it destroyed 30 years before its northern sister. However, the Wainriders succumbed to their own hubris, and their moment of triumph turned into their moment of defeat. If they had been victorious, Sauron would have waltzed back into Mordor, and there would not have been a single person to stop him. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, or at least found it interesting. In the video, I compare the Wainriders to the Huns. Did you know that there was a Eastern and Western Huns? Or that much like the Wainriders, very little is known of the Eastern Huns? It's a cool link, and I wonder if Tolkien was aware of it. Cheers, farewell, and remember, Wainriders is an archaic English word that isn't the most menacing name, but it's still far more menacing than wagon riders or cart riders.